Of our final video lesson training on how to respond to our language students' writing, how to assess their written works, correct their mistakes, and most importantly, provide them with our feedback, with the teacher feedback. And I would like to start off by asking you to think of the main features of effective feedback. Now, if you don't quite remember, you can maybe pause this video, go to our previous videos and refresh those in your memory. Or you can just share what you think in the comment section down below. I would like you to think of what makes our feedback, our language teachers' feedback, helpful to our learners. What makes it be the way that it facilitates student learning, that it helps them improve and progress. In particular when it comes to developing their written skills. So, well, the first feature of effective feedback that we talked about is that it should be encouraging. So this is one of the most important functions of the feedback that we give to our learners. It should not be demotivating. And how do we make sure that our feedback is encouraging? Well, we've got to be supportive. Through our feedback, we've got to let our learners know that we're there for them, and their progress and their learning and even their mistakes matter to us. Feedback can be encouraging if we do give some praise to our learners, but what's important is that it is not praise on their individual characteristics, on the features of their personality, but rather on the result of their work, on how successful their performance on this particular task, which is being assessed, is. Effective and what important is that we do not want to praise our learners for something that is not in that piece of writing, right? So if clearly this work does not live up to the standard, there is no need in saying good job overall if it's not, right? So, but still in most cases it is possible to find some positive features, something that we can praise our student for, something that we can say about that particular thing was good, that particular aspect was good. And if not for this particular piece of writing, then we might think of their previous pieces of writing, right? And like comment on the progress that they made in a certain aspect of their written work. Obviously, as I've already said, if there is nothing or to praise our learner for, we don't do that because we want to keep our feedback honest and genuine. This is very, very important because if our learner develops this feeling that no matter how hard they try, they will still get a good mark, they will still be praised, that kind of hampers their effort, right? That can affect their motivation to learn, their motivation to put effort negatively, and we don't want to do that. We want to praise our learners only for something that is really worth it. So we need to kind of like find this nice balance between being positive, being encouraging, being supportive, and being genuine and being objective, right? So, and once again, feedback should not be ego involving, if you remember that term from one of our previous videos, right? So we shouldn't say something like, John, you're such a smart boy, right? John, you're such an amazing student. John, even the worst out of these three, John, you're the best student in this class. John, you just do this task so well, nobody can compare to you, right? It should be task involving, so we comment on the task. Apart from commenting on something positive, on praising our learner, we should also obviously focus on something that needs improvement, right? Something that our learner needs to focus on more in their subsequent writing, right? And so we need to give some, criticism, maybe very often in the form of like criticism plus a little action plan. So our feedback should be well balanced. And if you remember in all those even business coaching videos, how to be a great manager, how to be a good teacher, there is this metaphor of a little sandwich, right? Feedback sandwich. When we have a little like top bun, it's something positive, a bottom bun, something positive as well, or like feet forward, a little nice wish for further development, and in the middle we have that constructive criticism, right? And that criticism should be constructive. What does it mean, constructive? Well, constructive means intended to help, right? Instead of saying, well, this is bad, this is not really good, this thing needs improvement, it's better to be more specific and to let our student how it can be improved, right? So it's just by saying you have so many mistakes, so many language mistakes, we're not helping our learner out anyhow. We need to always, when providing criticism, we need to think of how we can make it in a way that it helps them learn. Maybe instead of saying too many repetitions of the word medicine in your writing, we might want to say, can you please find at least 5 synonyms to the word medicine and share those to me, right? If the word medicine is repeated multiple times in their piece of writing. Please find at least 5 synonyms to the word medicine and show those to me by the end of by the beginning of our next class, or by the end, doesn't really matter, right? Our feedback should be selective. We don't want to overwhelm our learners with long texts. Well, sometimes I probably shared it with you, but when I started teaching, I really found myself writing much longer texts on the paper with my students' essays than their actual essays were. This is not something you want to do. First of all, you need to be you need to value your time and your energy. If you write those memoirs on every single student's piece of writing, you'll just end up spending all your time doing that. This is not what you want. So try to be brief. Try to provide them with feedback in brisk. And one of the ways of doing that is actually being selective. Not saying that if you write too much, if you comment on too many things on their piece of writing, that can actually be overwhelming for some learners. They might just think, there's so much to say about my mistakes. I'm probably so terrible at writing. When they're not, right? It's just you putting too much effort into providing them with feedback. So try to be selective. Focus on the things that you want to focus their attention on in this specific piece of writing that you want them to work on in their makeover, for example, right? And it's important to be specific. So instead of writing something like too many grammar mistakes. What does it mean, grammar? I think most mistakes in many pieces of writing can be referred to as grammar mistakes. What in particular is wrong with his or her grammar, right? What are the areas within that broad term grammar that need more attention, right? And it's important that our feedback is personalized, especially if we think of interactionalist approach to language teaching, when teaching is sort of a part of a conversation between a teacher and a learner, and it's a good idea to write our feedback in a form of a little, maybe short message, a little letter. First of all, you provide your learners with the model of a nice personal message, because it is a personal, individualized message from you to your learner, right? It just feels nice. It looks more encouraging rather than just like you criticizing their work. You kind of like you're saying something to them in a written form. It is perceived in a totally different way by learners. It's been proven. And what are other ways of make our feedback personalized? Well, you can, well, as I've already mentioned, you can address them by their name. You can be specific, and this is one of the ways of personalizing your feedback, so your learners do not have this feeling that you're copy-pasting generic comments, right, from one work to another. And you can refer to their previous pieces of writing, right, or to their progress that they've made over some time lately. This is really very important. This is a good idea. Your feedback should be error-free. This is probably one of the most important features of a teacher feedback, because we have seen so many examples of language teachers' feedback with language mistakes in them. And if you go back to our previous video, the 5th video in this module, we actually looked at some examples of language teachers' feedback with major language mistakes in there. And can you imagine the feedback that you provide your learners with actually stays in their copybook, and they may use it as a little reference when working on the further pieces of writing. So we don't want to make mistakes in our feedback, right? So what are the principles of responding to student writing? Well, that's something that we've already mentioned: encouragement and constructive criticism at the same time, not responding to every single problem, avoiding appropriation. Now, this is a very important one. When correcting our learners' mistakes in particular, or helping them to paraphrase certain statements, it's very important that we do not change their ideas. This is probably one of the important principles of how to correcting student writing. We're not working with their ideas, we're working with their language. That's why before paraphrasing, it's very important to make sure that you understand what they meant, right? You do not want to kind of like distort their ideas, right, and their what they wanted to say, because we want to help them fulfill their need for communicating their thoughts. And this is one of the most important things when it comes to communicative language teaching, right? Yeah, a little ongoing conversation is a nice form of delivering feedback and of thinking of the process of delivering feedback to our learners. Now, obviously, we start the process of assessing our learners' written works by working with the assessment scales, right? Especially if we prepare them for exams in English, for international tests. And if you remember, last time, or in one of our previous videos, we talked about different stages of working with the assessment scales. And will you please right now think what they are? What are the stages of how to work with an assessment scale, and with how to work with an assessment scale plus student writing? What are the staging of the whole process of assessing student writing using assessment scales? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think. We talked about different stages, so I would like to first give you an opportunity to formulate it to yourself, and then we will discuss it together. So obviously, when we receive a whole stack of student written works and an assessment scale, and if this is the assessment scale we're using for the first time in our life, or that we haven't been using for quite a while, this is one of well, the first thing that you might want to do is actually to refer to the assessment scale first, because this is something you're going to use when working with every single copy, right, of every single work of your students. So it's important to read carefully the assessment scale. And if you remember a little strategy that I shared with you in, as far as I remember, video 4 on this course, in this module, is to actually highlight the keywords in the assessment scale, the words that mark the difference between every single level on that assessment scale for a certain criteria, right? What makes the work that gets 3 points, let's say for content or for communicative achievement, different from the one that gets 2 points, right? And you highlight the keywords. And what important is here is that when highlighting keywords, in general, as a skill of working with texts, and an assessment scale is actually a text, it's important not to highlight to highlight very specific words that actually convey that information about the difference, right? You don't want to highlight general words, because otherwise there will be no point for that. You want to highlight only something that stands out for you. Then you read your student work, like the first work of your student, without marking, to get the grasp of the task achievement, and probably to evaluate the content and organization of the communicative achievement, right, of this piece of writing. It's very important, because if you start off correcting mistakes right away, you stop focusing on the content. It's impossible to be able to do both things well at the same time. To actually read and correct mistakes, and at the same time get the idea from the text. This is just the way it is. For example, think of another way of reading. If you're reading something out loud, right? If you're reading the text out loud, you're focusing very often, not everybody, but very often. Me, for example, if I'm asked to read a text out loud in front of many people, I stop focusing that much on what I'm reading about. I start focusing on another skill of reading out loud. If I'm reading well, if I'm pronouncing the words correctly, what other people think maybe about the way I'm reading it, right? So I'm focusing on another thing, if you're doing two things, right, simultaneously. And this drags my attention away from what I'm reading about, from the content. So if you compare yourself reading a text to yourself in silence, or reading the text out loud, therefore performing another skill at the same time, you'll probably get much more understanding of what the text is about in the first case, right? So it's very important to read it without marking in the very beginning, and locate the bits of information required by the task in this text, just to make sure that, okay, so they're supposed to answer 3 questions, this is the answer to the first question, this is the answer to the second question, this is the answer to the third question, right? Or if they are asked let's say, write about how they spend their holiday, what they did during their holiday, where they went, and who they spent it with. You make sure that all 4 bits of the information are in there. Right? Obviously, you get familiarized with the task at the same time as you get familiarized with the assessment criteria, right? Another reason why it's important to read your students' written work without marking first is that very often when you read and start marking right away, you might start correcting their written work just because you misinterpreted something, and then as you read further on, you understand, oh, they actually meant a different thing, and that might actually not be a mistake, right? So you go back to what you corrected, you start crossing it out, creating a mess in your student written work, and this is something that we want to stay away from. Now, that might sound actually daunting, and that might sound like, are you crazy? Am I supposed to be reading every single work of my learner twice? I don't have time for doing it just once, and you're asking me to do it twice. No, when I say read your student work without marking, I'm talking about cursory reading. You don't need to read, to spend a lot of time reading it for the first time. Just look it through, okay, and locate the most important bits of information and make judgments about the way the text is organized, right? So about the success of the task achievement for the criteria related to the content of the written work, right? The more you do that, the more you practice that, the less time it will take. So then, after we've kind of made our mind in terms of how successful this performance is in terms of its content, we can start off working with the language, and we can start off marking our student work by using different error correction strategies that we talked about in videos 1, 2, and 3 in this module. So you can pause this video if you don't remember those, go back to those videos and go back to this one. And after that, you can again go back to the assessment scale now to make judgments about the language, right? And finally, you write a little comment to your learner. And this is something, these are the stages we're going to try to follow right about now. We're going to assess a sample student piece of writing, and this is going to be a letter in the format of a OGE. And we're going to start with working with the assessment criteria, because I know that not all of you work with OGE. So if you are very well familiar with this assessment scale, you can just skip a couple of minutes of this video and go further to the point when we actually start working with our learner's piece of writing. If you're not, then it's a good chance to practice your assessment scale reading skill. Now I'm going to show you the assessment scale for the first 2 assessment criteria. So this is K1 and K2, communicative achievement, content / communicative achievement, and organization. I would like you to look through these 2 assessment criteria and like 3 bands for communicative achievement, 4 bands, sorry, and 3 bands for organization. Bands are like levels. And think of the keywords, of the words that you would highlight in this assessment criteria, the words that mark the difference between every single level. I'm giving about 1.5 minutes, or maybe up to 2 minutes to do that. And we'll do it together. right. So these are the keywords that I personally highlighted to myself. Obviously, they may differ a little bit from what you thought to be important keywords, but I think that generally this is what we have, right? So for the task, for the communicative achievement, if we want to give 3 points for this assessment criteria to our learners, then we make sure that they give full and very accurate answers for all 3 questions, right? In the task, all 3 questions. There are usually 3 questions. We're going to have a look at the sample task and make sure that they get that they answer 3 questions, right? So the style of the essay should be appropriate as required by the task. So this is an informal letter. This is going to be an, guide, they usually write an informal letter, right? So there should be, our learner should be, actually I didn't highlight, though I should have probably. Our learner should address their pen friend by name. They should write a little concluding phrase, maybe asking for further communication, and they should write their name, right? And yeah, all the kind of like norms of how to be polite when writing informal letter are respected as well. So yeah, well, there is like a little thank you for your letter, right? A little note about the future contact with this pen friend, right? Yeah, and maybe a little mentioning of previous content, right? So all that should be in there to get 3 points, right? So to get 2 points, there are still 3 questions answered, and there is 1 or 2 violation in the stylistic organization of the text, right? In the style and in the norms of politeness that our learner should follow, right? When responding to an informal letter. There should be, as for 1 point, right? As for band 1, there should be given the answers to the questions, but 2 answers are not well developed, elaborated, right, or not specific enough, or 1 answer is just not given. So there can be minor problems with 2 answers out of the 3, or just one question is ignored completely. So 2 good answers to 2 out of 3 questions, or 2 questions not well developed enough, with 1 being good. So this is what we give. For 2. This is what our learner can get 1 point for, right? And we get 0 if 2 questions are not answered, or answered in the way that does not meet up the standards, right? As for organization, the text should be logical. Well, though I did highlight this bit of the text, I think that this formulation is a little bit vague. What does mean logical? Because sometimes something that can be logical for me cannot quite be logical for you. So the text is divided into, but overall there are no problems with the organization. That's what they mean, right? The text should be divided into paragraphs, right? There should be nice linkers that make the text cohesive, right? Yeah. So this text is just spotless in terms of its organization. Something that is more helpful, the keywords that are more helpful are actually in band 1, right? The text is not always logical. I didn't highlight that because it doesn't really give me a lot of important information. what we get here is that there are not more than 2 logical mistakes, right? There are not more than 2 mistakes in the use of linkers, linking devices, or in the way our learner divided their text into paragraphs, and there are not more than 2 mistakes in how they decided to structure their texts, right? How they decided to organize their ideas and structure their text, they overlap a little bit. Very often one stems from the other. Our learner gets 0 if there are 3 or more logical mistakes, if the text is not divided into paragraphs the way it should be, and if there are 3 or more mistakes in the way our learner decided to organize their piece of writing. Now we're going to do the same with the other 2 criteria, and you get another 2 minutes to think of the keywords. Alright, so these are the words that I highlighted, right? The vocabulary used and grammar structures meet or correspond with the complexity of the task. There are no more than 2 language mistakes. This is very important, so that we may just need to make sure that language is not too simplistic and that there are no more than 2 language mistakes. So this is what they get 3 points for, right? If there's 1 language mistake, they still get maximum for language, for grammar and vocabulary. 2 is still okay. If there are 3, then they already get -1 point for language and vocabulary, right? As for band 2, then not all the vocabulary and grammar used they meet the complexity level of this type of the task. So if you find the structures and vocabulary units used a little bit simplistic, knowing the level of your learner or the level at which you're working with your learners right now, if they think that they don't use a lot of nice words that have recently been covered, right, or a lot of grammar structures that again have recently been covered, they are just limited to what they studied before, but there is not much of that, right? You just have a slight feeling that it's a bit simplistic, right? Not too much. And there are no more than 4 language mistakes. As for band 1, no more than 5 language mistakes. And as for band 0, there are, the language is too simple from your point of view, and there are 6 or more language mistakes. Now, as for vocabulary and grammar, we give 2 points for no more than 2 spelling and punctuation mistakes. Again, this is very important because a lot of teachers, though they do read that in the assessment criteria, or they don't, that's why we're actually working on that skill. If they see one spelling mistake, no, you don't get maximum for that. No, if they get one spelling mistake and this is the only problem that they have, even if they make 2 spelling mistakes and this is these are the only 2 problems that they have about that piece of writing, they still get maximum. But this is something that is not this is like something that a lot of teachers do in our experience, right? So please be careful when reading assessment criteria, right? If there are no more than 4 mistakes, they get 1 out of 2 for spelling and punctuation, and if there are 5 or more mistakes, they get 0 for spelling and punctuation. And now we're going to read the task itself, right? I'll give you maybe 1 minute to look at what's given in here. All right, the most important thing that we should pay attention here when assessing the content of our learner's essay, an informal letter are the 3 questions that I highlighted, right, for you in the text of the task. So our learner should say whether they've ever had to change the schools, and get used to new places, whether it was difficult for them to make new friends, and what they think about wearing school uniform. Now let's see how our learner did this task. So this is a letter. I'll give you about 1.5 minutes. Again, cursory reading. You remember, cursory reading. About 1.5 minutes to read the whole letter. Now, if you didn't have enough time to do that, you can pause this video right now and take a little more time to read this text of student writing by yourself, but I think that we can move on. And right now we're going to discuss the communicative achievement of this piece of writing, of this informal letter. We have the assessment criteria over here and our learner's letter over here. And if you want to take more time again to make sure that you understand how successful this performance in terms of its communicative achievement is, you can do that, but I think that we can do it together right away. So, are there all units that mark I located the parts of the text that represent those phrases that show that our learners know the norms of how to write informal letters in English, right? We have a little Dear Tom in the very beginning, so they address their pen friend by name. Thanks for your letter. They thank their pen friend for their letter. I haven't written earlier because I've been really busy at school these days. Well, I didn't highlight it, but still, there is kind of like a little reference to their previous communication, right? At the end, they write, I hope to hear from you soon. So this is a little mentioning of further context and contacts, and they've written love Tanya, so they signed this letter, right? So the conventions of this genre of written text are all met, and let's have a look whether all the questions are answered, and they actually are. We did find answers to the questions, right? Well, they do say that yes, I do have the experience of moving schools and getting used to a new place. I do have the experience of making friends, and it was quite easy for our learner. And we have one more paragraph whether they state their opinion about wearing school uniform and whether they agree or whether they're in favor of it or not. As for the text organization, again, feel free to pause this video and look through this piece of writing and the assessment criteria if you feel like it, or you can just follow us right now. So there are, right, again, some phrases that and bits of the text that make this text flow logically and smoothly, right? First of all, moreover, some linking words. Personally, I think, right, a little phrases to introduce your point of view. In your letter, you asked me a very nice way to start a sentence, the paragraph, right? Well, some teachers say that it's the body paragraph should be written in one paragraph, but I think that in the way this letter is written, it's pretty logical. They start the whole new idea about wearing a school uniform with a new paragraph. I think it's fair enough. So I would say that as well as for communicative achievement and content and for organization, this learner actually got maximum. For their letter, let's have a look at grammar and vocabulary. Again, if you feel like it, pause this video and work with the language mistakes yourself. Well, this is something that I highlighted. In your letter, you asked me about how easy it was for you to get used to new people and to the new place and new people. Well, actually, to get used to the new place, my family had to move to another place, and I quickly got used to a new place. A lot of repetitions, right? So there is a lack of flexibility, right? As for me, I love my new acquaintance. Doesn't really make sense. My new acquaintances, like the people I met, the friends I made there, is this what they meant? Otherwise, it's not clear who they're talking about, right? Probably they meant friends or acquaintances, or I enjoyed the process of making acquaintances, right, or making friends with other people. Then, first of all, the school uniform has strictness, which makes, right, a grammar mistake. Children study its school more seriously. What does it mean, its school more seriously? Study at school or at their school more seriously, or study school subjects more seriously? Not really clear. It's clear that there is a little problem, and probably at this point we can get our learner to correct themselves, right? Paraphrase themselves. Moreover, well, seriously, the word seriously, we can say to take school more seriously, but to study more seriously, I would mark it as a wrong word. To study not more seriously, it's like to study not smiling, right? To be very serious when studying. You can take things seriously as a fixed expression, kind of like as a collocation, but when you study very seriously, it's like you're very serious. You're not nice and open to others and like get distracted. So, moreover, then that isn't it isn't very expansive. Then that a syntactic problem, and probably they're aware of it. Okay, at least we can try to ask them to correct it. Maybe they can. Maybe it's just a lapse of concentration. And what about spelling? As for spelling and punctuation, we detected one spelling mistake. Sorry, I haven't written earlier. Now, some people say that if we follow proper punctuation rules or some reference websites say that after personally there should be a comma, but I've also read that now it is so common to not always put comma after it that there's been a little like there is now like a little variation of the norm. So I wouldn't really penalize a learner for that little problem with the comma. And anyway, even if there are two mistakes, spelling and punctuation mistakes, even if we do count that comma after personally, they still get maximum for their spelling and punctuation. What do they get for language and vocabulary, by the way? This is something that we didn't discuss. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, well, at least 5 mistakes, right? So, the lack of flexibility, right? Some repetitions. So that might be on the verge from 0 to 1. Can read more carefully into that and make your judgment. And finally, I would like you right now to think of what you're going to write to your learner in your final comment. We'll give you about 2 minutes right now to think. If you don't have enough time, you can again always pause the video and think a little more. I will actually give the text of their letter to you, so you have about 2 minutes to think of how you would formulate your feedback following the principles that we discussed in the beginning of this video. Alright, so this is the way I formulated my little feedback. Dear Tanya, you managed to give full answers to all questions, so good job. The text of your letter has a clear structure and you follow all the rules of how to write informal letters in English. Now that was a little, if we think again of a little feedback sandwich, that was the top bun, right? That was something that I did find really good about this piece of writing. There are a few language mistakes. Could you please paraphrase the bits of the text I highlighted? And therefore, I don't just say that, well, too many grammar mistakes or not really strong in terms of the vocabulary choice, right? I actually get them to do the job, my job, well, in a way, I get them to correct their mistakes themselves. And can you please think of what kind of error correction strategy I'm using in this case? What type of feedback? Is it direct or indirect feedback? Is it focused, unfocused, reformulation, meta-linguistic? Well, this is actually indirect feedback, right? I just highlighted it in the text for them and I get them to correct themselves. What should I remember about when doing that? It's very important that I do remember and I do find time to go back to their piece of writing and check that they were able to correct it themselves, and if they were not, then I do it for them, or I do it together with them. I help them to correct their mistakes themselves. Then there is some time for constructive criticism, right? There are a few language mistakes. This is the constructive criticism, and make sure you proofread your work, right, before submitting it. So there is another, instead of just criticizing them, I give them a little action plan. I give them a little suggestion of what they can do, right, to improve, because there is a little spelling mistake. Oh, and please avoid repetitions. For example, to, new, another place, there were 3 of them, if you remember, in 2 lines. So I am trying to be very specific. So instead of saying too many repetitions, what are the repetitions, where are the repetitions, they might not even know, they might not have a clue, but I actually let them know what the repetitions are, and I could also ask them, can you please give me 3 ways of how to say this thing when correcting your mistakes, right? 3 or 5 ways of how to replace this bit to a new place, to another place, right? And my little final kind of remark, kind regards, and I might sign it with my name, could have been another positive, like bottom bun, could include a little bit more of like positive comments at the end. I didn't feel like it over here because I think that all that I could praise them for, I did in the very beginning, so I decided to wrap it up with a nice, polite way of just wrapping up my message. Could write something like, looking forward to reading your makeover, right? I think that's about it. If you have any ideas, any feedback to share with us, it's always welcome. We will read everything, and I enjoyed giving a series of video lessons to you about feedback, teacher feedback, and different strategies of how to do that, both corrective feedback, which aims at correcting mistakes, and general feedback, which we give as a result of assessing our learners' progress. And I think I'll see you at some point in the future. Thank you. Bye.